rappelled down from the helicopter, their bright yellow jackets a beacon in the night. They quickly made their way over to Mark, medical kits in hand. "Sir, I'm Ranger Thompson, and this is Ranger Davis," the first one said, kneeling beside Mark. "Can you tell us your name and what happened?" "Mark Thompson," he replied, his voice hoarse. "I was attacked by a bear about 3 miles up the trail. Mother with cubs. I used my spray, managed to scare her off, but—" He trailed off, overcome by a sudden wave of emotion. The reality of what he had survived was beginning to sink in. Ranger Davis began examining Mark's injuries, while Ranger Thompson continued to ask questions. "You did the right thing with the spray, Mr. Thompson. Can you rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? Mark took a shaky breath. Maybe an 8. My back, it feels like it's on fire." The Rangers exchanged a glance. "We're going to get you out of here and to a hospital as soon as possible," Ranger Thompson assured him. "But first, we need to stabilize you for transport." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. The Rangers cleaned and properly bandaged Mark's wounds as best they could in the field, gave him something for the pain, and carefully secured him to a backboard. All the while, they kept up a steady stream of reassuring conversation, both to keep Mark calm and to monitor his alertness. As they prepared to airlift Mark out, Jenny and her friend approached. "We're so glad we found you," Jenny said, her eyes brimming with tears. "I hope you'll be okay." Mark managed a weak smile. "Thank you," he said softly. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." With a final nod to the young hikers, the Rangers signaled the helicopter. Mark felt himself being lifted, the ground falling away beneath him. As they ascended, he caught a final glimpse of the dark forest below, the place that had so nearly claimed his life. Then they were inside the helicopter, the door slamming shut, muffling the roar of the engines. The flight to the hospital was mercifully short. Mark drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain medication dulling both his discomfort and his awareness. He vaguely registered being rushed into the emergency room, bright lights and concerned faces swimming in and out of focus. "Bear attack victim," he heard someone say. "Multiple lacerations on the back and shoulders. Possible infection. Let's get him into trauma 3. The next few hours passed in a haze of examinations, questions, and treatments. Doctors cleaned his wounds thoroughly, stitching the deeper gashes and administering antibiotics to prevent infection. X-rays were taken to check for broken bones or internal injuries. Through it all, Mark answered the same questions over and over, recounting the attack in a detached voice that didn't seem like his own. It was nearly dawn when Mark finally found himself in a quiet hospital room, hooked up to IVs and monitors. The pain was more manageable now thanks to stronger medication, but he still felt as though he'd been hit by a truck. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, the door opened softly. "Oh, Mark," a familiar voice choked out. Sarah rushed to his bedside, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Hey," Mark said weakly, managing a small smile. "Sorry I missed dinner." Sarah let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She took his hand gently, mindful of the IV. "When the Rangers called, God, Mark, I thought I'd lost you." "It was close," Mark admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was a moment when I was sure, but I couldn't leave you. I had to fight." Sarah leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I'm so proud of you," she murmured, "and so grateful you're alive. But don't you ever scare me like that again, you hear me?" Mark nodded, feeling tears welling up in his eyes. The enormity of what he'd been through, what he'd almost lost, was finally hitting him. Sarah held him as best she could, mindful of his injuries as he wept quietly. A soft knock at the door interrupted the moment. A police officer entered, notepad in hand. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Officer Reeves. I know you've been through a lot, but I need to ask you a few questions about the attack, if you're up for it." Mark nodded, wiping his eyes. "Yeah, okay." For the next half hour, Mark recounted the events of the previous day in detail. He described the signs of bear activity he'd noticed, his encounter with the first bear, and finally, the terrifying attack by the mother bear. Officer Reeves listened intently, jotting down notes. "You mentioned you used bear spray," the officer said. "Did you have any other weapons with you?" Mark shook his head. "No, Just the spray. I never thought I'd actually need to use it. Officer Reeves nodded sympathetically. Well, it likely saved your life. We'll need to send a team up to investigate the area, but from what you've told me, it sounds like you did everything by the book. These things happen sometimes, even to experienced hikers. As the officer was preparing to leave, he paused at the door. One more thing, Mr. Thompson. A reporter from the local news heard about the attack. They're asking for an interview. You're not obligated to speak with them. Of course. Mark and Sarah exchanged a glance. I don't know, Mark said hesitantly. Maybe in a day or two when I'm feeling a bit stronger. Officer Reeves nodded. That's fine. I'll let them know you need some time to recover. Take care, Mr. Thompson. You're one lucky man. As the door closed behind the officer, Sarah squeezed Mark's hand. He's right, you know. You are lucky. Mark nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions wash over him. Yeah, he said softly. I know. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the hospital room window, Mark felt his eyelids growing heavy. The events of the past 24 hours had left him utterly drained, both physically and emotionally. As he drifted off to sleep, Sarah's hand still clasped in his, Mark knew that while his ordeal was over, his journey to recovery, both physical and mental, was just beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of medical procedures, visits from concerned friends and family, and fitful sleep punctuated by vivid nightmares of gnashing teeth and razor-sharp claws. Mark's injuries, while serious, were thankfully not life-threatening. The doctors assured him that with proper care and physical therapy, he would make a full recovery. On the third day of his hospital stay, a gentle knock on the door roused Mark from a light doze. Sarah, who had barely left his side, looked up from her book. Come in, Mark called, wincing slightly as he adjusted his position in the bed. A man in his mid-40s entered, notepad in hand and a press badge clipped to his shirt pocket. Mr. Thompson? I'm Dave Larson from the Knoxville News Sentinel. I was hoping I could have a few minutes of your time to discuss your experience. Mark hesitated, glancing at Sarah. They had discussed the possibility of talking to the press, weighing the pros and cons. On one hand, Mark wasn't sure he was ready to relive the attack in detail. On the other, he felt a responsibility to share his story as a cautionary tale for other hikers. Sarah gave him an encouraging nod. It's up to you, honey. Taking a deep breath, Mark turned back to the reporter. All right, Mr. Larson, I'll talk to you, but I reserve the right to stop if it becomes too much. Dave nodded, pulling up a chair. Of course, Mr. Thompson. I appreciate you taking the time. Let's start at the beginning. What made you decide to go on this solo hike? For the next hour, Mark recounted his harrowing experience. He described the beauty of the trail, the initial thrill of spotting bear signs, and the heart-stopping moment when he realized he had come between a mother bear and her cubs. As he spoke, Mark found himself reliving the terror of the attack, his heart rate increasing as he described the bear's charge. I really thought that was it, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. I could smell her breath, feel her weight, crushing me. But somehow I managed to reach my bear spray. It was pure instinct at that point. Dave scribbled furiously in his notepad, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. When Mark described his painful journey back down the trail, the reporter shook his head in amazement. That's incredible, Mr. Thompson. Your will to survive is truly remarkable. Now, if you don't mind me asking, how has this experience changed? Your view of nature, of hiking? Mark was quiet for a moment, considering the question. It's complicated, he finally said. I've always loved the outdoors, always felt a connection to nature. This experience hasn't destroyed that, but it's definitely changed it. I have a newfound respect for the raw power of wild animals, for the delicate balance between humans and nature. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I don't want my story to scare people away from hiking or enjoying our national parks, but I do hope it serves as a reminder of the importance of preparation, of respecting wildlife and their habitat. We're visitors in their home, after all. Dave nodded, jotting down a few more notes. That's a powerful message, Mr. Thompson. One last question, if I may. What advice would you give to other hikers who might find themselves in a similar situation? Trust your instincts, Mark said without hesitation. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't be afraid to turn back or change your plans. And always, always carry bear spray and know how to use it. It saved my life. As the interview wrapped up, Dave stood extending his hand carefully to Mark. Thank you for sharing your story, Mr. Thompson. I believe it will resonate with a lot of people. I'll make sure to send you a copy of the article before it goes to print. After the reporter left, Sarah moved to sit on the edge of Mark's bed. You did great, honey. How are you feeling? Mark let out a long breath. Drained, but oddly relieved too. Like talking about it helped make it more real, if that makes sense. For a while there, it all felt like some terrible dream. Sarah squeezed his hand gently. It wasn't a dream. You survived something incredible, Mark, and I'm so proud of you. The next day, true to his word, Dave sent over a draft of the article. Mark read it with mixed emotions, seeing his experience laid out in black and white. The headline read, "Local man survives harrowing bear attack in Smoky Mountains." The article was well written, accurately capturing the terror of the attack and the strength Mark had found to survive. It also included information about bear safety and the importance of proper preparation for backcountry hikes. As Mark finished reading, he noticed a small note at the bottom of the email from Dave. Mr. Thompson, thank you again for sharing your story. I've passed it along to some national outlets who have expressed interest. Don't be surprised if you get a few more interview requests in the coming days. Mark showed the email to Sarah, who raised an eyebrow. National outlets? Are you up for that kind of attention? He shrugged, wincing slightly at the movement. I'm not sure. Part of me wants to just put this all behind us and focus on recovery. But if sharing my story can help prevent someone else from going through this, maybe it's worth it? Sarah nodded thoughtfully. It's your decision, Mark. Whatever you choose, I'll support you. Over the next few days, as Mark's condition improved, and he prepared for discharge, the predicted interview requests began to roll in. Local TV stations, outdoor magazines, and even a national morning show all reached out, eager to hear the story of the man who fought off a bear and lived to tell the tale. Mark agreed to a few select interviews, always emphasizing the importance of wildlife safety and proper preparation. He found that talking about his experience, while emotionally draining, helped him process what had happened. Each retelling seemed to lessen the grip of fear that had taken hold in the wake of the attack. As the media attention began to die down, Mark faced a new challenge, returning home and beginning the process of physical and emotional recovery. The day of his discharge, as Sarah helped him into the car, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. The man staring back at him looked older, more weathered, but there was a determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Ready to go home? Sarah asked, squeezing his hand. Mark nodded, taking a deep breath. Yeah, I think I am. As they drove away from the hospital, Mark's thoughts turned to the future. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be physical therapy sessions, possibly counseling to deal with the trauma, and the slow process of rebuilding his confidence in the outdoors. But he also knew that he had survived something extraordinary, and that experience had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The bear attack would always be a part of him now, a pivotal moment that had tested his limits and revealed strengths he didn't know he possessed. As the familiar streets of Knoxville came into view, Mark made a silent promise to himself. He would heal, he would recover, and someday, when he was ready, he would return to the trails. Not in fear, but with a newfound respect for the wild and a deeper appreciation for the precious gift of life. The weeks following Mark's return home were a challenging blend of physical recovery and emotional adjustment. His days were filled with doctor's appointments, physical therapy sessions, and the slow process of regaining strength and mobility. The deep claw marks on his back were healing, but they served as a constant reminder of his brush with death. One particularly frustrating afternoon, Mark found himself struggling with a set of exercises designed to improve his range of motion. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he attempted to reach behind his back, a movement that had once been effortless but now sent sharp pains shooting through his shoulder. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth, pushing himself to complete the repetition. Sarah, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped into the room. "Maybe that's enough for today, honey. You don't want to overdo it. Mark lowered his arm, unable to hide his frustration. I can't even put on a shirt without wincing. Sarah, how am I supposed to get back to normal like this? Sarah sat down next to him on the bed, her expression a mixture of concern and understanding. Recovery takes time, Mark. You've been through a traumatic experience. Your body needs time to heal. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know. It's just, I feel so helpless sometimes. Like that bear took something from me that I can't get back. Sarah took his hand, squeezing it gently. You're not helpless, Mark. You're one of the strongest people I know. You survived something most people can't even imagine. Give yourself some credit. As Mark was about to respond, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Dave Larson, the reporter who had written the initial article about his attack. Huh? Mark said, scanning the message. Dave says there's been a lot of interest in my story. He's wondering if I'd be willing to do a follow-up interview, talk about the recovery process. Sarah raised an eyebrow. How do you feel about that? Mark considered for a moment. I'm not sure. Part of me wants to just move on, you know? But another part, I don't know, maybe talking about it more could help. Not just me, but maybe other people who've been through something similar. It's your decision, Sarah said, but I think it could be good for you. You've been so focused on the physical recovery, maybe it's time to address the emotional side, too. After some deliberation, Mark decided to agree to the interview. A few days later, he found himself sitting across from Dave in their living room, a camera set up to capture their conversation. Mark, it's good to see you up and about, Dave began, his tone friendly but professional. How has the recovery process been going? Mark shifted slightly, trying to find a comfortable position that didn't pull at his healing wounds. It's been challenging, he admitted. Physically, I'm making progress. The doctors say I'm healing well. But mentally, that's been tougher than I expected. Dave nodded encouragingly. Can you elaborate on that? Mark took a deep breath. The nightmares were the worst at first. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling the bear's weight on me, smelling its breath. Those have gotten better, but I still have moments where a sudden noise or movement will send my heart racing. That sounds like a form of PTSD, Dave commented. Have you sought any professional help to deal with the trauma? Mark nodded. I've been seeing a therapist who specializes in trauma recovery. It's been helpful, talking through the experience, learning coping mechanisms. But it's a process, you know. There's no quick fix. The conversation continued, touching on various aspects of Mark's recovery. They discussed the physical therapy, the support he'd received from family and friends, and the unexpected challenges he'd faced in returning to everyday life. As the interview was winding down, Dave asked a question that caught Mark off guard. You mentioned in our first interview that you hoped your story would serve as a cautionary tale for other hikers. Now that you've had time to reflect, has your perspective on that changed at all? Mark was quiet for a moment, considering his response. You know, when I first got out of the hospital, part of me wanted to tell everyone to stay out of the woods, to never hike alone. But that's not the right message. Nature is beautiful, and experiencing it is worth the risks, if you're prepared. He leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. What I want people to take away from my story is the importance of respect. Respect for nature, for wildlife, for the power of the wilderness. Be prepared, be aware, but don't let fear keep you from experiencing the beauty of our world. After the interview wrapped up, Mark felt drained but oddly lighter, as if sharing his ongoing journey had lifted a weight from his shoulders. Sarah, who had been listening from the kitchen, came in and wrapped her arms around him carefully. You did great, she murmured. I'm so proud of you. In the days that followed, Mark found himself thinking more about the future. The interview had forced him to confront questions he'd been avoiding. Would he ever feel comfortable hiking alone again? Could he return to the Smoky Mountains without being overwhelmed by fear? One evening, as he and Sarah were enjoying a quiet dinner, Mark broached the subject. I've been thinking, he began hesitantly. Maybe we could plan a short hike, nothing too strenuous, just a day trip, together. Sarah looked up, surprise and concern flickering across her face. Are you sure you're ready for that? Mark nodded slowly. I think I need to do it. Not to prove anything, but I don't want that bear to have the last word, you know? I love the outdoors too much to let fear keep me away forever. Sarah reached across the table, taking his hand. Okay, she said softly. We'll do it together, baby steps. Over the next few weeks, Mark and Sarah began planning their day hike. They chose a well-traveled trail in a nearby state park, one known for its scenic views, but not its wildlife. Mark threw himself into the preparation, researching the trail, checking and double-checking their gear. The night before the hike, Mark stood in front of the mirror, examining the scars on his back. They were still red and angry looking, but no longer caused him pain. He ran his fingers over them gently, remembering the terror of the attack, but also the strength he'd found within himself to survive. Sarah appeared in the doorway, watching him with a mixture of love and concern. Second thoughts? She asked. Quietly. Mark turned to her, a small smile on his face. No, actually, for the first time in a while I'm feeling excited. Nervous, sure, but excited too. Sarah crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him, careful of his still healing back. You've come so far, Mark. I'm so proud of you. As they stood there, holding each other, Mark felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew that tomorrow's hike was just the first step on a long journey. There would be challenges ahead, moments of fear and doubt. But he also knew that he was stronger than he had ever given himself credit for. The bear attack had changed him, there was no denying that. But as he prepared to step back into the wilderness, Mark realized that it hadn't broken him. Instead, it had revealed a resilience he never knew he possessed, and with Sarah by his side, he was ready to face whatever the trail might bring. Tour. Morning of the hike dawned clear and crisp, a perfect autumn day in eastern Tennessee. Mark stood in the driveway, double-checking the contents of his backpack one last time. Water bottles, trail mix, first aid kit, map, compass, and of course, bear spray. His hands lingered on the canister, memories of its life-saving use flashing through his mind. Sarah emerged from the house, her own pack slung over her shoulders. Ready to go? She asked, a mix of excitement and concern in her voice. Mark took a deep breath, nodding. As ready as I'll ever be. The drive to the state park was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled into the parking lot, Mark felt a flutter of anxiety in his stomach. The trailhead looked innocuous enough, with its wooden sign and well-maintained path disappearing into the trees. But he couldn't shake the memory of another trail, another day that had started just as peacefully. We don't have to do this if you're not ready, Sarah said softly, sensing his hesitation. Mark shook his head, forcing a smile. No, I want to. Need to, really. Let's go. They set off down the trail, the crunch of leaves under their boots and the chirping of birds providing a soothing soundtrack. Mark found himself hyper-aware of his surroundings, eyes scanning the underbrush, ears straining for any unusual sounds. After about half an hour, they paused in a small clearing to catch their breath and have some water. Sarah watched Mark carefully as he took a long drink from his water bottle. How are you doing? She asked. Mark considered the question. It's strange, he admitted. Part of me feels at home out here, like I always have. But another part is just waiting for something to go wrong. Sarah nodded, understanding. That's normal, I think. You've been through a traumatic experience. It's going to take time to feel completely comfortable again. As they continued their hike, Mark found himself relaxing incrementally. The familiar rhythm of walking, the beauty of the autumn foliage, and Sarah's comforting presence all helped to ease his anxiety. They chatted about work, friends, plans for the upcoming holidays, normal, everyday topics that felt wonderfully mundane in the context of their surroundings. Around midday, they reached a scenic overlook. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills covered in a patchwork of reds, oranges, and golds, stretching as far as the eye could see. Mark stood at the edge, taking it all in, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. It's beautiful, Sarah murmured. Coming to stand beside him, Mark nodded, putting his arm around her. Yeah, it really is. I'd almost forgotten how much I love this. They sat down to eat their packed lunch, enjoying the view and each other's company. As they were packing up to head back, a family with 2 young children arrived at the overlook. The kids, full of energy, ran ahead of their parents, laughing and pointing at various sights. The younger one, a boy of about 7, spotted something in the underbrush and darted towards it. "Jimmy, don't go too far," his mother called out. Without thinking, Mark was on his feet. "Wait," he called out to the boy, his voice sharper than he intended. The boy stopped, startled, as his parents hurried to catch up. Mark approached slowly, trying to calm his racing heart. "Sorry," he said to the parents, who were looking at him with a mixture of confusion and concern. There could be animals in there. It's best to stay on the trail." The father nodded, gently pulling his son back. "Of course, you're right. Thanks for the warning. Come on, Jimmy, let's stay where we can see you." As the family moved away, Sarah came to stand beside Mark. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Mark nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, I saw that kid running off and all I could think about was—" "I know," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "You did the right thing." They started their return journey, the encounter with the family weighing on Mark's mind. He realized that his experience had changed not just how he viewed his own safety in the wilderness, but how he perceived potential dangers for others as well. About halfway back to the trailhead, they heard a rustling in the bushes off to the side of the trail. Mark froze, his hand instinctively going to the bear spray on his belt. Sarah tensed. Beside him, watching his reaction as much as the source of the noise. A moment later, a raccoon ambled out onto the trail, seemingly unconcerned by their presence. It looked at them for a moment before wandering off into the underbrush on the other side. Mark let out a long, shaky breath, his hand falling away from the bear spray. He chuckled softly, the sound tinged with relief and a hint of embarrassment. "Well," he said, "I guess I'm still a bit jumpy." Sarah smiled, rubbing his arm reassuringly. "It's okay. Better to be alert than careless, right?" They continued on, the encounter with the raccoon serving as a gentle reminder that not every wildlife encounter was a threat. As they neared the end of the trail, Mark found himself reflecting on the day. "You know," he said to Sarah, "this has been good, really good. I was worried that being out here would just bring back bad memories, but it's reminded me of why I love hiking in the first place." Sarah beamed at him. "I'm so glad to hear that. You've been so brave today, Mark." He shook his head. "I don't know about brave, but I do feel, more like myself again. Like I'm taking back something the bear tried to take from me." As they emerged from the tree line into the parking lot, Mark felt a sense of accomplishment wash over him. It hadn't been an epic trek or a challenging climb, but in many ways this simple day hike had been one of the most important of his life. Back in the car, as they prepared to head home, Sarah turned to him. "So, what do you think? Was this a one-time thing, or—" Mark considered for a moment before answering. "No, I don't think it was. I want to do this again. Maybe try some slightly more challenging trails as I get stronger. But always together, at least for now." Sarah smiled, leaning over to kiss him on the cheek. "Together sounds perfect." As they drove home, the autumn scenery flashing by outside the windows, Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The bear attack would always be a part of him, a reminder of both the dangers and the wonders of the natural world, but it no longer defined him. Today he had taken the first steps towards reclaiming his love for the outdoors, towards healing not just his body but his spirit as well. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments of fear to overcome. But as the familiar streets of Knoxville came into view, Mark knew that he was on the right path. With Sarah by his side and a renewed appreciation for the beauty and power of nature, he was ready to face whatever lay ahead, both on the trail and off. As the weeks turned into months, Mark's recovery continued to progress. His physical therapy sessions became less frequent, and the angry red scars on his back faded to silvery lines. The nightmares, once a nightly occurrence, now only visited occasionally. Life was slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy, but Mark knew he would never be quite the same person he was before the attack. One crisp Saturday morning in early spring, Mark sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through his emails. An unfamiliar sender caught his eye. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Visitor Experience Survey. With a mix of curiosity and trepidation, Mark opened the email. It was a request for park visitors to share their experiences, both positive and negative, to help improve safety measures and visitor education programs. The survey was anonymous, but there was an option to include contact information for potential follow-up. Sarah walked into the kitchen, noticing Mark's furrowed brow. "Everything okay?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Mark turned the laptop so she could see the screen. "The park is doing a survey about visitor experiences. They want to hear from people who've had incidents." Sarah sat down beside him, reading over the email. "Are you thinking of responding?" Mark nodded, slowly. "Yeah, I think I am. If sharing my story can help prevent someone else from going through what I did, or even just improve the park's safety measures, it seems worth it." Over the next hour, Mark carefully filled out the survey, detailing his experience from the moment he entered the park to his dramatic rescue. He described the signs of bear activity he had noticed, his use of bear spray, and the actions he took after the attack. When he reached the end of the survey, he hesitated for a moment before checking the box indicating he was willing to be contacted for further information. "Done," he said, hitting the submit button. "I guess we'll see if anything comes of it." To Mark's surprise, he received a phone call just a few days later. The caller introduced himself as John Lawson, the head ranger for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. "Mr. Thompson," Ranger Lawson began, "I want to thank you for sharing your experience with us. Your detailed account is incredibly valuable for our ongoing efforts to improve visitor safety." Mark felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. "I'm glad it's helpful. To be honest, I wasn't sure if I should submit it or not." "We're very glad you did," Lawson assured him. "In fact, I was wondering if you might be willing to participate in a more in-depth discussion about your experience. We're putting together a panel to review our current safety protocols and educational materials, and your perspective would be invaluable." Mark was taken aback. "A panel? I'm not sure I'm qualified for something like that." Lawson chuckled warmly. "Mr. Thompson, you've got first-hand experience that most of our experts thankfully lack. Your insights could help shape how we approach bear safety education for years to come." After discussing the details with Sarah, Mark agreed to participate. A month later, he found himself driving back to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for the first time since his attack. As they passed the familiar entrance sign, Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "You okay?" she asked softly. Mark nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, I think so. It's strange being back here, but it feels right somehow." They pulled into the parking lot of the park headquarters, where they were greeted by Ranger Lawson. He was a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, welcome," he said, shaking. "Can the hands? We really appreciate you coming out here today." Inside, they were led to a conference room where several other people were already gathered. Lawson made the introductions. There was Dr. Emily Chen, a wildlife biologist specializing in bear behavior, Tom Becker, an experienced park guide, and Lisa Hartman, the park's head of visitor education. As they settled into their seats, Lawson addressed the group. "Folks, as you know, we're here to review and potentially revise our bear safety protocols and educational materials. Mr. Thompson's experience last year highlighted some areas where we might be able to improve." For the next few hours, Mark found himself recounting his story once again, but this time to an audience that peppered him with specific, technical questions. They wanted to know exact locations, times of day, detailed descriptions of the bear's behavior, and his own actions before and after the attack. Dr. Chen was particularly interested in Mark's description of the bear's initial reaction to the spray. "The fact that it temporarily retreated but then charged again is noteworthy," she mused. "It suggests we might need to emphasize the importance of continued defensive actions even after deploying spray." Tom Becker nodded in agreement. "We should also consider updating our guidelines on solo hiking. Maybe emphasize the buddy system more strongly, especially in areas with high bear activity." As the discussion continued, Mark found himself becoming more engaged. He wasn't just recounting a traumatic experience anymore, he was actively contributing to efforts that could prevent similar incidents in the future. "You know," he said during a break in the conversation, One thing that I think could be really helpful is some kind of hands-on demonstration of proper bear spray use. I had the spray. I knew I was supposed to use it, but in the heat of the moment, it was harder than I expected to deploy it effectively. Lisa Hartman's eyes lit up. That's an excellent idea. We could incorporate that into our ranger-led informational sessions, maybe even create a video demonstration for our website. As the meeting wound down, Ranger Lawson turned to Mark with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Thompson, I have a proposition for you. We occasionally conduct educational outreach programs, speaking at schools and community centers about park safety. Would you be interested in participating in some of these sessions, sharing your experience firsthand?" Mark was surprised by the offer. I'm not sure. Do you really think people would want to hear from me?" Lawson nodded emphatically. "Absolutely. Your story is powerful, Mr. Thompson. It's one thing for us to talk about bear safety and the abstract, but hearing from someone who's been through it, that could really drive the message home." Mark looked at Sarah, who gave him an encouraging smile. "It's up to you," she said softly, "but I think you'd be great at it." After a moment's consideration, Mark turned back to Lawson. "Okay," he said, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. "I'll do it." As they left the park headquarters later that afternoon, Mark felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since before the attack. He had come to the park as a victim, reliving a traumatic experience. He was leaving as an advocate with the opportunity to turn his ordeal into something positive. "You know," he said to Sarah as they drove home, the park receding in the rear view mirror, "I think this is the first time since the attack that I've felt, I don't know, like it all happened for a reason, like maybe some good can come out of it after all." Sarah reached over, intertwining her fingers with his. "I'm so proud of you, Mark. You're going to help a lot of people." As they continued their drive home, Mark found himself looking forward to the future in a way he hadn't in months. The bear attack had changed him. There was no denying that. But now, instead of simply being a victim of circumstance, he had the chance to be an agent of positive change. It wasn't the path he would have chosen, but it was one he was now ready to embrace. The weeks following Mark's meeting at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park headquarters were a whirlwind of activity. He found himself thrust into a new role as a wildlife safety advocate, speaking at local schools, community centers and outdoor clubs about his experience and the importance of proper preparation when venturing into bear country. On a crisp autumn morning, almost exactly a year after his fateful encounter, Mark stood before a group of high school students in the auditorium of Knoxville Central High. The nervous energy in his stomach reminded him of the day of the attack, but he took a deep breath and began his presentation. "A year ago, I was just like many of you," he started, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I loved the outdoors, thought I knew enough to stay safe, and never imagined I'd come face to face with a black bear. But on October 15th, that's exactly what happened." As Mark recounted his story, he could see the students' expressions change from mild interest to rapt attention. When he described the moment the bear charged, he heard audible gasps from the audience. "I'm not here to scare you away from enjoying our beautiful national parks," Mark continued, "but I am here to stress the importance of respect, preparation, and knowledge when it comes to wildlife encounters." After his presentation, a hand shot up in the audience. A young girl, probably a freshman, asked timidly, "Aren't you afraid to go hiking now?" Mark smiled, appreciating the honesty of the question. "That's a great question. And the truth is, yes, sometimes I am. But I've learned that fear doesn't have to control us. With proper preparation and respect for wildlife, we can still enjoy the beauty of nature." As the students filed out of the auditorium, many stopped to thank Mark or ask additional questions. One boy lingered behind, waiting until the crowd had thinned before approaching. "Mr. Thompson," he said hesitantly, I had a scary encounter with a bear last summer while camping with my family. Nothing as serious as yours, but, well, I've been too afraid to go back into the woods since then. Do you have any advice?" Mark felt a surge of empathy for the young man. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Alex," the boy replied. "Well, Alex, I understand exactly how you feel," Mark said. "It took me a long time to feel comfortable in the woods again. But you know what? Helped, starting small. Short hikes in well-populated areas, always with a buddy. And most importantly, educating myself about bear behavior and safety measures. Knowledge is power, Alex. The more you understand, the less frightening it becomes. Alex nodded, a small smile forming on his face. Thanks, Mr. Thompson. Maybe I'll give it another try. As Mark packed up his materials, the school principal approached him. That was an excellent presentation, Mr. Thompson. The students were really engaged. I think you've made a real impact today. Mark felt a warmth spread through his chest. Thank you. I hope so. If even one student takes wildlife safety more seriously because of this, it's worth it. Later that evening, as Mark recounted the day's events to Sarah over dinner, his phone buzzed with an incoming email. It was from Ranger Lawson at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. What is it? Sarah asked, noticing Mark's furrowed brow as he read the message. Mark looked up, a mix of surprise and excitement on his face. They want me to participate in a national park safety campaign. Apparently, word of my presentations has spread, and they think my story could have a broader impact. Sarah beamed at him. Mark, that's fantastic. Are you going to do it? Mark nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face. Yeah, I think I am. It's strange, you know? A year ago, I thought that Bear had taken something from me. But now I feel like I've found a new purpose. Over the next few months, Mark found himself at the center of a comprehensive wildlife safety campaign. He recorded video interviews, participated in the creation of new educational materials, and even helped design a hands-on bear spray training program for park visitors. The campaign launched in the spring, just as hikers and campers were preparing for the upcoming season. Mark's story was featured prominently, his face appearing on posters and in videos at visitor centers across the country. One sunny afternoon, Mark and Sarah decided to visit the Great Smoky Mountains National Park to see the campaign materials in action. As they entered the main visitor center, Mark felt a surreal sense of déjà vu. There, larger than life on the wall, was a photo of him standing on a trail, bear spray prominently displayed on his belt. Well, that's not something you see every day, Sarah chuckled, squeezing his hand. As they wandered through the center, they overheard a park ranger giving a safety briefing to a group of hikers. The ranger was using one of the new interactive displays that Mark had helped develop, demonstrating proper bear spray technique. Remember, the ranger was saying, in the event of a bear encounter, stay calm, make yourself look big, and back away slowly. Use your bear spray only if the bear charges. Mark felt a sense of pride hearing his own advice being passed on to others. As the group dispersed, one of the hikers noticed Mark and did a double take, looking between him and the poster on the wall. Hey, aren't you the bear attack guy? The hiker asked, approaching Mark. Mark nodded, extending his hand. That's me, Mark Thompson. The hiker shook his hand enthusiastically. Man, your story really made an impact on me. I used to be pretty careless about wildlife safety, but after hearing what you went through, well, let's just say I take it a lot more seriously now. As they continued their visit, Mark was approached by several more people who recognized him from the campaign. Some shared their own wildlife encounter stories, while others simply wanted to thank him for raising awareness about park safety. Towards the end of their visit, they ran into Ranger Lawson, who greeted them warmly. Mark, Sarah, great to see you both. How does it feel to be a wildlife safety celebrity, Mark? Mark chuckled, shaking his head. It's surreal, to be honest, but if it helps keep people safe, I'm all for it. Lawson nodded approvingly. Well, I've got some news that might interest you. Since launching the campaign, we've seen a significant increase in visitors participating in our safety workshops and properly equipping themselves for backcountry hikes. Early data suggests a decrease in negative human-wildlife interactions as well. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. That's incredible to hear. As they left the park that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Mark felt a sense of peace wash over him. The memory of the attack would always be with him, but it no longer haunted him the way it once had. You know, he said to Sarah as they drove home, for a long time after the attack, I felt like a victim. But now I feel like a survivor. More than that, I feel like I'm making a difference. Sarah reached over, taking his hand. You are making a difference, Mark. You took something terrible and turned it into something positive. I'm so proud of you." As the familiar landscapes of eastern Tennessee rolled by, Mark reflected on the journey of the past year, from the terror of the attack to the long road of recovery, and now to this new chapter as an advocate for wildlife safety. It wasn't a path he would have chosen, but he was grateful for where it had led him. The bear may have left its mark on him, but Mark had found a way to leave his own mark on the world, turning his traumatic experience into a force for positive change. As they neared home, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose and a deep appreciation for the second chance he'd been given, not just to survive, but to truly live and make a difference. 2 years had passed since Mark Thompson's life-altering encounter with the black bear in the Great Smoky Mountains. The scars on his back had faded to silvery lines, barely visible unless you knew where to look. His role as a wildlife safety advocate had become an integral part of his life, balanced alongside his accounting career and family responsibilities. Adi. A crisp autumn morning, not unlike the day of his attack, Mark stood at the trailhead of the Alum Cave Trail. Sarah was by his side, her hand clasped tightly in his. They had discussed this moment for months, Mark's return to the very trail where his life had nearly ended. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, concern evident in her voice. Mark took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of pine and damp earth. "I'm sure it's time." As they set off down the trail, Mark found himself hyper-aware of his surroundings. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping twig made him tense. But there was something else too, a sense of homecoming, of reconnecting with a part of himself he had feared lost forever. About an hour into their hike, they paused at a small clearing. Mark's eyes scanned the area, recognition dawning on his face. "This is where it happened," he said softly. "Right over there, behind that fallen log." Sarah squeezed his hand. "How do you feel?" Mark was quiet for a moment, processing the complex emotions swirling within him. "Scared," he admitted, "but also, I don't know. Grateful, I guess. Grateful to be here, to have survived, to have the chance to face this fear." As they stood there, the sound of approaching hikers broke the silence. A family rounded the bend, parents with 2 young children. The father, a tall man with a friendly face, nodded as they approached. "Morning," he called out. "Beautiful day for a hike, isn't it?" Mark nodded, a small smile on his face. "It certainly is. You folks prepared for bear country?" The mother patted her backpack. "Bear spray, bear bells, and we've been making plenty of noise. Can't be too careful out here." A warmth spread through Mark's chest. This was why he did what he did now. To see people taking wildlife safety seriously, to know that his story had made a difference. "Good to hear," Mark said. "Enjoy your hike and stay safe out there." As the family moved on, Sarah turned to Mark. "You didn't tell them, did you? About what happened here?" Mark shook his head. "No need. They're prepared, aware. That's what matters." They continued their hike, the familiar landmarks bringing back memories both good and bad. As they neared Alum Cave Bluffs, the spot where Mark had first noticed signs of increased bear activity 2 years ago, they encountered a park ranger giving a safety talk to a group of hikers. "Remember," the ranger was saying, "if you encounter a bear, stay calm. Make yourself look big, back away slowly, and use your bear spray only as a last resort." Mark couldn't help but smile. It was advice he had helped refine, based on his own harrowing experience. The ranger noticed Mark and Sarah listening and nodded in acknowledgement. As the group dispersed, he approached them. "Thanks for listening in," he said. "Can't stress safety. Enough out here. You folks have any questions?" Mark exchanged a glance with Sarah before responding. "Actually, I might be able to add something to your talk. I'm Mark Thompson." Recognition flashed across the ranger's face. "Mark Thompson, the bear attack survivor? I'll be damned. Your story's part of our training now, you know." For the next half hour, Mark shared his experience with the ranger, offering insights and suggestions for future safety talks. As they parted ways, the ranger shook Mark's hand firmly. "Thank you for what you're doing, Mr. Thompson. You're saving lives out here, whether people realize it or not." As Mark and Sarah continued their hike, reaching Alum Cave Bluffs without incident, a sense of accomplishment washed over Mark. He stood at the viewpoint, taking in the breathtaking vista of autumn colors spread out before him. "I did it," he said softly. "I really did it." Sarah wrapped her arm around his waist. "You did. I'm so proud of you, Mark." On their way back down the trail, they encountered more hikers, families, and solo trekkers alike. Mark found himself naturally falling into his role as a safety advocate, offering friendly reminders and tips to those they met. As the parking lot came into view, signaling the end of their journey, Mark felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, but also a sense of closure he hadn't realized he'd been seeking. "You know," he said to Sarah as they reached their car, "I think I needed this. To come back here, to face it all again." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "And how do you feel now?" Mark considered the question carefully. "Like I've taken back something the bear tried to take from me. My love for this place, for hiking, for the outdoors. It's different now, tempered with respect and caution, but it's still there." As they drove home, the Great Smoky Mountains receding in the rearview mirror, Mark reflected on the journey of the past 2 years, the terror of the attack, the long road to recovery, and now this, a return to the scene not as a victim, but as a survivor, an educator, an advocate. That evening, as they relaxed at home, Mark's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Ranger Lawson at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. "What is it?" Sarah asked, noticing Mark's thoughtful expression. "They're expanding the wildlife safety program," Mark explained. "They want me to be part of a national advisory board, helping to shape wildlife safety policies across all national parks." Sarah beamed at him. "Mark, that's amazing. Are you going to do it?" Mark nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, I think I am. It feels right, you know, like this is where all of this was leading." As he sat there, contemplating this new opportunity, Mark realized how far he had come. The bear attack had changed him. There was no denying that. But instead of letting it define him as a victim, he had found a way to redefine himself as an advocate, an educator, someone who could make a real difference in the world. The scars on his back would always be there, a permanent reminder of that terrifying day. But now they stood for something more: resilience, survival, and the power to turn a traumatic experience into a force for positive change. As Mark Thompson looked to the future, he felt a sense of purpose and peace. He had faced his fears, returned to the scene of his darkest moment, and emerged stronger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them, armed with the knowledge and perspective gained from his journey. The Great Smoky Mountains would always be a part of him now, not as a place of fear, but as a testament to the human spirit's capacity for growth, resilience, and transformation. And as he embraced this new chapter in his life, Mark knew that his story was far from over. It was in many ways just beginning. Now let's go to the next attack case. If you're enjoying it, leave a like and a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Let's move on to the next one. Sarah Mitchell eased her worn pickup truck into the gravel parking lot at the edge of Yellowstone National Park, the engine's rumble fading to silence as she cut the ignition. For a moment, she sat still, savoring the crisp autumn air that seeped through the cracked window. The scent of pine and damp earth filled her lungs, a stark contrast to the stuffy classroom she'd left behind in Bozeman. Another year, another fishing trip, she murmured to herself, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. At 42, these solo excursions had become something of a ritual for Sarah, a chance to shed the responsibilities of teaching and reconnect with the wild heart of Montana that had captivated her since childhood. She stepped out of the truck, her boots crunching on the gravel. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the lot, the light still soft and golden. Sarah stretched, working out the kinks from the long drive, then moved to the truck bed to retrieve her gear. "Let's see," she muttered, rifling through her backpack. "Water check, first aid kit check, bear spray." Her hand closed around the canister, and she nodded with satisfaction. "Check." As she sorted through her fly fishing equipment, a park ranger's truck pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing a friendly face framed by a wide-brimmed hat. "Morning, ma'am," the ranger called out. "Heading out for some fishing?" Sarah nodded, lifting her rod case in greeting. "That's the plan. Thought I'd try my luck on the Lamar River today." The ranger's expression turned thoughtful. Lamar's a beautiful spot, but we've had a few bear sightings in that area recently. You familiar with bear safety protocols? Oh yes, Sarah replied, patting her bear spray. I've been coming here for years. Always stay alert, make noise, and keep my distance if I spot one. Good to hear, the ranger said, visibly relieved. Just remember, if you do encounter a grizzly, don't run. Stand your ground, speak calmly, and back away slowly. If it charges, that's when you use that spray. Sarah nodded, appreciating the reminder despite her experience. Will do. Thanks for the heads up. As the ranger drove off, Sarah finished packing her gear. She locked up the truck and set off down the trail leading to the Lamar River, her excitement building with each step. The path wound through dense pine forest, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking vistas of the surrounding mountains. Sarah paused at one such clearing, drinking in the view. The jagged peaks, still capped with the last remnants of summer. Snow stood in stark contrast to the riot of autumn colors, painting the lower slopes. God, I've missed this, she whispered, her voice filled with reverence. As she continued her hike, Sarah made sure to make plenty of noise, singing snatches of old folk songs and occasionally calling out, "Hey, bear!" It felt a bit silly, but she knew it was better to announce her presence than to surprise a foraging grizzly. After about an hour of hiking, the sound of rushing water reached her ears. Sarah quickened her pace, emerging from the tree line to find the Lamar River spread out before her, a ribbon of silver cutting through the rugged landscape. Perfect, she breathed, already scanning the water for promising spots to cast her line. Sarah made her way down to the riverbank, carefully picking her way over the smooth, round stones. She found a relatively flat area and set down her backpack, then began assembling her fly rod with practiced ease. As she worked, Sarah let her mind wander, thinking about the stack of essays waiting for her back home and the parent-teacher conferences looming on the horizon. But with each passing moment, those concerns seemed to fade, replaced by the simple, immediate pleasures of the present, the cool breeze on her face, the burble of the river, the anticipation of the first cast. "All right," she said, selecting a fly from her box. "Let's see if we can't fool a few trout today." Sarah waded into the shallows, the cold water seeping into her waders. She took a moment to center herself, feeling the current tug at her legs, then began to cast. The line unfurled gracefully, the fly settling on the water's surface with barely a ripple. For the next hour, Sarah lost herself in the rhythm of casting and retrieving, moving slowly upstream as she searched for the perfect spot. She caught and released a few smaller trout, but the real prize, a big, wily cutthroat, remained elusive. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Sarah paused to take a drink of water and have a quick snack. She perched on a large boulder near the water's edge, fishing rod propped beside her, and unwrapped a granola bar. Not a bad way to spend a Saturday, she mused aloud, gazing out at the river. A movement on the opposite bank caught her eye, a flicker of brown against the green and gold of the forest. Sarah squinted, trying to make out what it was. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it might be a bear. But then a deer emerged from the undergrowth, pausing to drink from the river. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Jumpy much, Mitchell?" she chided herself, with a chuckle. As she finished her snack, Sarah noticed the wind picking up, carrying with it the promise of rain. Dark clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon, and she knew she'd have to wrap up her fishing soon if she wanted to avoid getting caught in a downpour. Just a few more casts, she promised herself, standing and retrieving her rod. Sarah waded back into the river, this time aiming for a deep pool she'd spotted earlier. The water was faster here, and she had to plant her feet carefully to maintain her balance. She began to cast, the familiar motion soothing away the last of her lingering tension. On her third cast, there was a sudden, violent tug on the line. Sarah's heart leaped as she realized she'd hooked something big. The fish, a cutthroat trout she was sure, fought hard, darting back and forth across the pool in a desperate bid for freedom. "Oh no, you don't," Sarah grunted skillfully, playing the line. For several minutes it was a battle of wills between woman and fish. Sarah's arms began to ache, but she refused to give up. Slowly, gradually, she worked the trout closer to shore. Just as she was about to reach for her net, a loud crash echoed from the tree line behind her. Sarah froze, her grip on the rod loosening. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by the snapping of branches. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. She turned slowly, her eyes widening in terror as a massive grizzly bear emerged from the forest, its dark eyes fixed squarely on her. The fishing rod slipped from her numb fingers, clattering against the rocks as it fell. The splash seemed to startle the bear, and for a moment, predator and prey stood motionless, locked in a silent tableau of fear and instinct. In that frozen instant, Sarah's mind raced through everything she knew about bear encounters. Don't run. Make yourself look big, speak calmly. But as the grizzly took a lumbering step forward, all of that knowledge evaporated, replaced by a single primal urge: survive. The peace of the autumn morning shattered as the bear charged, and Sarah's world exploded into chaos and pain. The serenity of the autumn morning shattered in an instant as Sarah's eyes locked with those of the grizzly bear. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into an eternity as her mind struggled to process the danger before her. The bear, a massive creature with fur the color of burnt honey, stood on its hind legs at the edge of the tree line, its head swiveled, nostrils flaring as it caught Sarah's scent on the breeze. For a moment it seemed almost curious, its dark eyes studying her with an unsettling intelligence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the bear must hear it. She tried to recall everything she knew about bear encounters, but panic clouded her thoughts, leaving only fragments of advice floating through her mind. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the rush of the river. "Don't run. Make yourself look big." Slowly, moving with exaggerated care, Sarah raised her arms above her head, trying to make her 5'6" frame appear as imposing as possible. Her fishing rod, forgotten, bobbed in the current beside her, the line still taut with the trout she'd been fighting moments ago. "Hey, bear," she called out, striving for a tone that was firm but non-threatening. "I see you there. I don't want any trouble. I'm just going to back away slowly, okay?" The grizzly dropped to all fours, its massive paws leaving imprints in the soft earth of the riverbank. It tilted its head, seeming to consider Sarah's words. For a fleeting moment, she dared to hope that it might simply lose interest and amble back into the forest. That hope was dashed as the bear let out a low, rumbling growl that Sarah felt in her very bones. "Oh, God," she breathed, her legs trembling. With the effort of not fleeing outright, Sarah began to inch backward, her boots sliding on the slick rocks of the riverbed. She kept her eyes on the bear, remembering the ranger's warning about not turning her back. The grizzly matched her movements, taking a step forward for each step she took back. "Easy now," Sarah said, her voice quavering despite her best efforts to sound calm. "There's no need for this, plenty of fish in the river for both of us, right?" The bear's only response was another growl, deeper this time, its lips curling back to reveal yellowed teeth the size of Sarah's fingers. Sarah's heel caught on a submerged rock, and she stumbled, nearly losing her footing. That small movement was all it took to trigger the bear's predatory instincts. With a roar that seemed to shake the very air, the grizzly charged. "No!" Sarah screamed, all thoughts of standing her ground evaporating in the face of 800 pounds of muscle and fury bearing down on her. She turned and ran, splashing through the shallows towards the shore. Her mind raced, trying to remember where she'd left her backpack with the bear spray. Was it upstream or down? How far? She couldn't remember, couldn't think of anything beyond the primal need to escape. The sound of the bear's pursuit filled, her ears punctuated by the creature's huffing breaths and the splash of its paws in the water. Sarah risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. The grizzly was closing the distance with terrifying speed, its powerful legs eating up the ground between them. Sarah's foot slipped on a moss-covered rock, and she went down hard, landing on her side in the shallow water. Pain lanced through her hip and elbow, but adrenaline pushed it aside as she scrambled to her feet. "Help!" she screamed, knowing even as she did so that there was no one around to hear. "Somebody help me!" She made it 3 more steps before a crushing weight slammed into her back, driving her face first into the riverbed. Water filled her nose and mouth as she gasped in shock and pain. The bear's hot breath washed over her neck, and she felt its claws rake across her back, tearing through her jacket and shirt as if they were tissue paper. In that moment, A strange calm settled over Sarah. A detached part of her mind observed that this might be how she died, not peacefully in her sleep, at a ripe old age, but here on the banks of the Lamar River, torn apart by a creature that was only following its instincts. "I'm sorry," she thought, though she wasn't sure to whom she was apologizing. To her parents, perhaps, for the pain they would feel when they learned of her fate. To her students, who would wonder why Mrs. Mitchell never came back from her weekend trip. The bear's weight shifted and Sarah felt herself being flipped over. She found herself staring up into the grizzly's face, close enough to see the flecks of gold in its brown eyes. Its jaws opened wide, and Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the killing blow. But it didn't come. Instead, a new sound cut through the air. A high-pitched whistle followed by a loud crack. The bear's head whipped around, distracted by the noise. Sarah's eyes flew open, hope surging through her veins. "Hey!" a voice shouted from somewhere upstream. "Get out of here, you big brute!" The bear hesitated, clearly torn between its potential meal and this new threat. Another whistle pierced the air, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the water nearby. With a frustrated growl, the grizzly backed off, lumbering a few steps away from Sarah. It rose onto its hind legs again, searching for the source of the disturbance. Sarah didn't waste the opportunity. Ignoring the pain that radiated through her body, she rolled onto her stomach and began to crawl towards the shore. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through her, but she gritted her teeth and pressed on. "That's it. Keep moving," the voice encouraged. "I'm coming to help you." Sarah glanced up to see a figure making its way along the riverbank towards her. It was another fisherman, a man in his 60s by the look of him, waving his arms and shouting to keep the bear's attention. The grizzly, apparently deciding that its meal wasn't worth the hassle, dropped back to all fours. It cast one last look at Sarah, then turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. Sarah collapsed onto the rocky shore, her body shaking with a mixture of relief, pain, and residual terror. She heard the crunch of gravel as her rescuer approached. "My God," the man said, kneeling beside her. "Are you all right? No, don't try to move. I've got a satellite phone. I'm calling for help right now." Sarah managed a weak nod, unable to form words just yet. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the full extent of her injuries made themselves known. Her left arm, which had taken the brunt of the bear's initial swipe, hung uselessly at her side. She could feel warm blood seeping from multiple gashes across her back and legs. "You're going to be okay," the man assured her as he spoke rapidly into his phone. "Help is on the way. You're safe now." That was some quick thinking, playing dead. Like that? Sarah blinked in confusion. Had she played dead? She couldn't remember making a conscious decision to do so. Perhaps her body had taken over when her mind froze, falling back on the bare safety training she'd received years ago. As she lay there on the cold stones, listening to her rescuer relay their location to the emergency services, Sarah's gaze drifted back to the river. Her fishing rod was long gone, swept away by the current. The peaceful scene that had greeted her earlier that morning now seemed alien and hostile. A chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes settled over Sarah. She knew that even after her physical wounds healed, the memory of this day would stay with her forever. The wilderness she had always loved now held a new, darker aspect, one of tooth and claw, of primal fear and the razor-thin line between life and death. As the distant sound of a helicopter reached her ears, Sarah closed her eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Her last conscious thought before slipping into unconsciousness was a fervent hope that when she woke, this would all have been nothing more than a terrible dream. The world came back to Sarah in fragments. The rhythmic thump of helicopter blades, voices shouting medical jargon, the sharp sting of antiseptic. She blinked, trying to focus on her surroundings, but everything was a blur of motion and noise. "She's coming around," a voice said close to her ear. "Ma'am, can you hear me? You're in a medevac helicopter. We're taking you to the hospital in Bozeman." Sarah tried to nod, but a neck brace held her head immobile. She managed a weak yes instead, her voice barely audible over the din of the helicopter. "Good," the paramedic said, his face swimming into view. "You've been in a bear attack. You remember what happened?" The memories came flooding back. The peaceful morning by the river, the sudden appearance of the grizzly, the terror of the chase, and then pain. So much pain. Bear. Sarah croaked, her throat raw. It came out of nowhere. You're lucky to be alive, the paramedic said, checking her vitals. A fisherman scared it off and called for help. Can you tell me where it hurts the most? Sarah tried to take stock of her injuries, but it seemed easier to list the parts of her that didn't hurt. My arm, she finally managed. Left arm, can't move it. The paramedic nodded grimly. It's broken. We've stabilized it for now, but you'll need surgery when we get to the hospital. You've also got some nasty lacerations on your back and legs. We're giving you pain medication through an IV, but let me know if it gets unbearable, okay? Sarah mumbled an acknowledgement, her mind still struggling to process everything that had happened. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the chaos around her. But the image of the bear's face so close to hers was burned into her eyelids. The helicopter ride seemed to last both an eternity and no time at all. Before Sarah knew it, they were touching down on the hospital's helipad. The doors flew open, and she was whisked inside on a gurney, bright fluorescent lights flashing overhead as they raced through the corridors. Female, 42 years old, victim of a grizzly bear attack in Yellowstone. One of the paramedics rattled off to the waiting emergency room staff. Multiple lacerations, possible internal injuries, confirmed fracture of the left humerus. She's been in and out of consciousness during transport. Sarah felt herself being transferred to a hospital bed, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body. A doctor leaned over her, shining a penlight in her eyes. Ms. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Reeves. Can you follow my finger with... Your eyes, Sarah complied, her gaze tracking the doctor's movement. Good, Dr. Reeves said. We're going to take care of you, but first we need to assess the full extent of your injuries. I'm going to ask you some questions, okay? Just nod or shake your head if it hurts to speak. What followed was a whirlwind of tests, scans, and examinations. Sarah drifted in and out of awareness, the pain medication making everything hazy. She caught snippets of conversation around her, multiple deep lacerations requiring immediate debridement. Comminuted fracture of the left humerus. We'll need to schedule surgery. Potential nerve damage, we'll know more after. At some point, a police officer appeared by her bedside, notepad in hand. Ms. Mitchell, I know you've been through a lot, but I need to ask you a few questions about the attack. Are you up for that? Sarah nodded weakly. I'll try, she whispered. The officer's questions were straightforward, but answering them forced Sarah to relive the terrifying encounter. She described the bear's sudden appearance, its charge, the desperate attempt to escape. With each detail, the reality of what had happened sank in deeper. You did everything right, the officer assured her. Playing dead probably saved your life. We'll have rangers out there looking for the bear, but these things can be tricky. Animals don't exactly respect park boundaries. As the officer left, Sarah was struck by a sudden overwhelming sense of vulnerability. The bear was still out there. What if it attacked someone else? What if it somehow found her here? A nurse must have noticed her rising distress, because a moment later, Sarah felt a warm hand on her uninjured arm. Try to rest now, the nurse said gently. You're safe here. We're going to take good care of you. Sarah wanted to believe her, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bear's face, felt its hot breath on her skin. She jerked awake from fitful dozes, her heart racing, certain for a moment that she was back on that riverbank. As the hours wore on, a steady stream of medical professionals came and went. Sarah's arm was set and put in a cast, her lacerations cleaned and stitched. The pain ebbed and flowed, never quite disappearing despite the medication coursing through her veins. It wasn't until late that night, when the hospital had quieted, and the initial frenzy of treatment had subsided, that Sarah finally had a moment to truly process what had happened. Lying in the darkened room, listening to the steady beep of monitors, she felt tears begin to roll down her cheeks. She had always known, intellectually, that there were risks to her solo wilderness excursions. But in all her years of hiking and fishing, she had never truly believed that something like this could happen to her. The realization of how close she had come to death hit her like a physical blow. Sarah's quiet sobs must have alerted the night nurse, because soft footsteps approached her bed. Oh, honey, the nurse said, her voice full of compassion. It's okay to let it out. You've been through a terrible ordeal. I could have died, Sarah choked out, if that fisherman hadn't come along. But you didn't die, the nurse said firmly. You survived, you fought, and you lived. That's something to be proud of. Sarah nodded, trying to take comfort in the nurse's words. But as the night wore on and sleep continued to elude her, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The world seemed darker now, more dangerous. The wilderness she had always loved now held a new, terrifying aspect. The first light of dawn began to filter through the hospital room window. Sarah made a silent vow to herself. She would recover, she would heal, but she would never again take her safety for granted. The bear had taken more than just flesh and bone. It had stolen her sense of security, her unquestioning love for the wild. And as she finally drifted off, into an uneasy sleep, Sarah wondered if she would ever be able to look at a forest or a mountain stream the same way again. The days following the attack blurred together for Sarah, a haze of pain medication, surgeries, and fitful sleep punctuated by vivid nightmares. It wasn't until nearly a week after her admission that she began to feel truly lucid again. The morning light filtering through the hospital room window found her propped up in bed, idly flipping through a magazine with her good hand, when a knock at the door caught her attention. "Come in," she called, her voice still raspy from disuse. The door opened to reveal Dr. Reeves, the emergency room physician who had first treated her. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell," he said, offering a warm smile. "How are you feeling today?" Sarah considered the question. The pain in her arm had dulled to a persistent ache, and the multitude of cuts and bruises covering her body were beginning to itch as they healed. But it was the psychological wounds that troubled her most. The way her heart raced at unexpected noises, the flashes of terror that gripped her in quiet moments. "Better, I think," she finally answered, "at least physically." Dr. Reeves nodded, understanding as he pulled up a chair beside her bed. "That's good to hear. I wanted to check in on you and discuss your recovery plan. You've made remarkable progress, but there's still a long road ahead." Sarah listened as the doctor outlined the next steps: physical therapy for her arm, follow-up appointments to monitor her healing lacerations, and a recommendation for trauma counseling. It all felt overwhelming, a stark reminder of how drastically her life had changed in the span of a few terrifying minutes. "I know it's a lot to take in," Dr. Reeves said, noting her expression. "But you're not alone in this. We have an excellent support system here, and there are resources available for survivors of animal attacks." "Survivor," Sarah echoed, the word feeling strange on her tongue. "I suppose that's what I am now, isn't it?" The doctor leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Ms. Mitchell, what you did out there, playing dead when the bear attacked, that was incredibly brave. Your quick thinking saved your life." Sarah shook her head, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I don't feel brave," she admitted. "I feel as broken. Every time I close my eyes, I see that bear. I can smell its breath, feel its weight on me. How do I get past that?" Dr. Reeves' expression softened. "What you're experiencing is a normal response to trauma. It's going to take time, but with proper support and therapy, you can work through this. Have you considered talking to someone about what happened?" Sarah hesitated. The thought of reliving the attack, of putting words to the terror she had experienced, made her stomach churn. But a small part of her recognized the need to confront her fears if she ever hoped to move past them. I think I'd like that," she said quietly. Dr. Reeves nodded approvingly. "I'll have our trauma counselor, Dr. Patel, stop by later today. In the meantime, is there anything else you need? Any questions about your recovery?" Sarah was about to shake her head when a thought occurred to her. "Actually, yes. The bear, do you know if they found it? Is it still out there?" The doctor's expression turned grave. "I'm afraid I don't have any updates on that. The park rangers are still investigating, but these things can be complicated. Wild animals don't exactly leave calling cards." Sarah nodded, trying to ignore the chill that ran down her spine at the thought of the bear still roaming free. "I understand. Thank you, Doctor." After Dr. Reeves left, Sarah found herself lost in thought. The idea that there was no closure, no neat resolution to her ordeal, was unsettling. The bear was out there somewhere, oblivious to the havoc it had wreaked on her life, simply following its instincts. Her ruminations were interrupted by another knock at the door. This time, it was a nurse bringing in her lunch tray. As Sarah picked at her food, She couldn't help but marvel at how ordinary everything seemed. The world had kept turning while she lay in this hospital bed, her own personal universe shattered and slowly being pieced back together. Later that afternoon, as promised, Dr. Patel arrived. The trauma counselor was a petite woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately put Sarah at ease. "Hello, Sarah," she said, settling into the chair by the bed. "I'm Dr. Patel. Dr. Reeves mentioned you might like to talk about what happened." "How are you feeling about that?" Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Nervous," she admitted, "but I think I need to do this." Dr. Patel nodded encouragingly. "Why don't we start at the beginning? Tell me about that morning, that before the attack." Haltingly at first, then with growing fluency, Sarah began to recount the events of that fateful day. She described the peaceful morning by the river, the sudden appearance of the bear, the terror of the chase. As she spoke, she found herself reliving the experience, the icy grip of fear, the desperate scramble for survival, the moment when she thought it was all over. "And then," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "when it had me pinned, when I could feel its breath on my face, I just went limp. I stopped fighting. It was like my body knew what to do even when my mind had given up." Dr. Patel leaned forward, her expression compassionate. "That's an incredible survival instinct, Sarah. Playing dead in that situation was exactly the right thing to do. It's a testament to your strength and resilience." Sarah shook her head, feeling tears well up in her eyes. "But I don't feel strong. I feel broken. Like something inside me is permanently damaged. What you're feeling is a normal response to an abnormal situation," Dr. Patel assured her. "Trauma changes us, but it doesn't have to define us. With time and support, you can learn to integrate this experience into your life without letting it control you." As their session continued, Sarah found herself opening up about her fears, not just of bears or the wilderness, but of the unpredictability of life itself. She spoke of her love for nature, now tainted by fear, and her uncertainty about the future. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to go back out there," she confessed. "The thought of being in the woods again, it terrifies me." Dr. Patel nodded understanding. "It's okay to feel that way. Recovery isn't about erasing what happened or pretending you're not affected by it. It's about learning to live with the experience, to find new ways of engaging with the world that feels safe for you." As their session drew to a close, Sarah felt emotionally drained but also unexpectedly a bit lighter. Putting words to her fears had made them seem somehow more manageable, less all-consuming. "Thank you," she said, as Dr. Patel prepared to leave. I think this helped." The counselor smiled warmly. "I'm glad to hear that, Sarah. Remember, healing is a process. Be patient with yourself. We'll talk again soon." Left alone, Sarah settled back against her pillows, her mind replaying the conversation. For the first time since the attack, she felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she wasn't facing it alone. As the afternoon sun slanted through the window, Sarah closed her eyes. This time, instead of the bear's snarling face, she saw the peaceful river, heard the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The image was tinged with sadness now, a bittersweet reminder of what she had lost. But it was also a promise that someday, somehow she might find her way back to that sense of peace. With that thought, Sarah drifted off into the first truly restful sleep she'd had since the attack, her dreams filled not with terror, but with the gentle murmur of a mountain stream. As the days in the hospital turned into weeks, Sarah's physical recovery progressed steadily. The deep gashes left by the bear's claws began to heal, leaving angry red lines across her skin that the doctors assured her would fade with time. Her broken arm, now encased in a cast, ached less with each passing day, but the psychological wounds remained raw, a constant undercurrent to her waking hours, and the source of nightmares that still plagued her sleep. It was on a crisp autumn morning, not unlike the one that had lured her to Yellowstone weeks ago, that Dr. Reeves entered, her room with news that sent a jolt of anxiety through her. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, his tone upbeat. "I've got some good news for you. We think you're ready to be discharged." Sarah felt her heart rate quicken, a mixture of relief and apprehension washing over her. "Really?" she asked, her voice small. I'm not sure I'm ready." Dr. Reeves pulled up a chair beside her bed, his expression softening. "I understand your hesitation," he said gently. "But medically speaking, you've made remarkable progress. Your wounds are healing well, and there's no sign of infection. The next stage of your recovery can be done as an outpatient." Sarah nodded, slowly, trying to process the information. The hospital, despite its sterile environment and constant interruptions, had become a sort of sanctuary. Here she felt safe, protected from the dangers that now seemed to lurk in every shadow of the outside world. "What about my arm?" she asked, gesturing to the cast. "You'll need to keep the cast on for a few more weeks," Dr. Reeves explained. "We'll schedule follow-up appointments for x-rays and to monitor your progress. And of course, you'll continue with physical therapy to regain strength and mobility." Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. "And psychologically, I still have nightmares almost every night. Sometimes during the day I feel like I'm back there, with the bear." Dr. Reeves nodded, understanding. "That's completely normal given what you've been through. Dr. Patel has recommended that you continue with regular therapy sessions. She's provided a list of trauma specialists who can work with you on an outpatient basis." As the doctor continued to outline her discharge plan, Sarah found her mind wandering. She thought of her small apartment in Bozeman, wondering if it would feel like home or like another cage. She thought of her students, who had sent a flood of get-well cards that now decorated her hospital room. And she thought of the mountains, visible from her bedroom window, that had once called to her with promises of adventure, and now loomed as a reminder of nature's brutal indifference. "Sarah?" Dr. Reeves' voice pulled her back to the present. "Do you have any questions about your discharge?" She shook her head, then paused. "Actually, yes. What do I do if I see a bear? I mean, I know it's unlikely in town, but..." The doctor's expression was sympathetic. "It's natural to have those fears after what you've been through. Remember, the skills you used, staying calm, playing dead, they saved your life. Those instincts are still with you. But if it would make you feel safer, there are bear safety courses available. They might help you feel more prepared." Sarah nodded, grateful for the suggestion. "I think I'd like that," she said softly. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paperwork, final checkups and well-wishes from the hospital staff who had cared for her over the past weeks. As evening approached, Sarah found herself sitting on the edge of her bed, dressed in her own clothes for the first time since the attack. Her left arm, still in its cast, was cradled in a sling, and a small bag of prescriptions and care instructions sat beside her. A knock at the door drew her attention. It was Nurse Chen, who had been a constant, comforting presence throughout her stay. "Your ride is here," Chen said with a warm smile. "Are you ready to go home?" Sarah took a deep breath, looking around the room that had been her entire world for weeks. "As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose," she replied, trying to inject a confidence into her voice that she didn't quite feel. Chen helped her gather her belongings and guided her to the wheelchair that hospital policy required for discharge. As they made their way through the corridors, Sarah found herself studying the faces of the people they passed. Other patients, visitors, staff. She wondered how many of them had their own stories of survival, their own invisible scars. At Ney, the hospital entrance, Sarah was surprised to see not just her parents, who had been regular visitors throughout her stay, but also a small group of her colleagues from the high school where she taught. "Welcome back, Sarah," they cheered as Chen wheeled her out. Their faces were a mixture of joy and concern, and Sarah felt a lump form in her throat at the sight. Her mother rushed forward, enveloping her in a gentle hug. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, "we're so glad to have you home." As Sarah carefully got to her feet, accepting hugs and well-wishes from her friends, she felt a strange mix of emotions wash over her. There was gratitude for the support system she clearly had, anxiety about the challenges that lay ahead, and an underlying current of sadness for the carefree woman she had been just weeks ago, a woman who had never known the terror of being prey. "We've got your apartment all set up," her father said as he took her bag. "Your mom's been stress cleaning for days." Sarah managed a small laugh at that. "I'm sure it's spotless," she said. picturing her mother's nervous energy channeled into scrubbing every surface. As they made their way to the car, Sarah paused, turning to look back at the hospital. It had been her shelter, her place of healing for so long. Leaving felt like stepping off a cliff, not knowing if she had a parachute. "You okay, honey?" her mother asked, noticing her hesitation. Sarah nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Yeah," she said. "I'm okay, let's go home." The drive back to her apartment was surreal. Sarah found herself studying the familiar streets of Bozeman with new eyes, half expecting danger to leap out from behind every tree and building. When they finally pulled up to her complex, she felt a mix of relief and trepidation. Inside her apartment, Sarah was touched to find vases of flowers on every surface, get-well cards propped up on shelves, and a large welcome home banner strung across the living room. Her friends had clearly gone all out to make her homecoming special. As everyone bustled around, arranging food and chatting, Sarah found herself drawn to the large window that looked out over the mountains. The peaks were dusted with the first snow of the season, beautiful and remote. She placed her hand on the cool glass, feeling the barrier between herself and the wilderness that had once been her playground. "It's still out there," she murmured, to herself. "And so am I." In that moment, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would heal, not just physically, but mentally. She would find a way to reconcile the beauty of nature with its dangers. And someday, when she was ready, she would return to those mountains, not with the naive fearlessness of before, but with a hard-won respect for the wild and a deeper appreciation for her own resilience. As she turned back to join her family and friends, Sarah felt a small spark of determination ignite within her. The bear had taken much from her, but it hadn't taken everything. She was still here, still fighting, and that, she realized, was its own kind of victory. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Sarah's bedroom, casting a warm glow across the rumpled sheets. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, momentarily disoriented by the familiar surroundings of her own room. It had been a week since her discharge from the hospital, and she was still adjusting to being back home. Sarah sat up slowly, wincing as her healing wounds protested the movement. Her left arm, still encased in its cast, felt heavy and awkward. She glanced at the clock on her bedside table, 7:30 a.m. On a normal day, she would have been up an hour ago, preparing for her classes at the high school. But nothing was normal anymore. With a sigh, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and reached for her phone. There were several missed calls and messages, mostly from well-wishers she hadn't yet had the energy to respond to. But one notification caught her eye, a voicemail from Tom Henderson, the principal at her school. Sarah hesitated for a moment before pressing play. Tom's voice filled the room, warm and concerned. "Sarah, it's Tom. I hope you're doing okay. Listen, I know you're still recovering, but when you feel up to it, I'd love to sit down and talk about your return to work. No pressure, just give me a call when you can. Take care of yourself." The message ended, leaving Sarah with a knot in her stomach. Return to work. The thought both excited and terrified her. How could she stand in front of a classroom of teenagers when she still jumped at every unexpected noise? How could she teach about the beauty of Montana's wilderness when the mere thought of stepping into a forest sent her heart racing? Pushing these thoughts aside, Sarah slowly got to her feet and made her way to the kitchen. The simple act of making coffee one-handed had become a daily challenge, but one she was determined to master. As the coffee brewed, she leaned against the counter, her gaze drifting to the window. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in morning mist. Once that view had filled her with excitement and longing, now it sent a shiver down her spine. The wilderness that had been her sanctuary had become a source of fear and painful memories. A sharp knock at the door startled Sarah from her reverie, causing her to jump and spill hot coffee on her hand. "Damn it," she muttered, reaching for a towel. "Sarah? It's me, open up." The voice belonged to her best friend and fellow teacher, Lisa. Sarah took a deep breath, composing herself before opening the door. Lisa stood there, a bright smile on her face and a paper bag in her hands. "Morning, sunshine, I brought breakfast." Sarah managed a small smile. "You didn't have to do that." Of course I did, Lisa said, breezing past her into the apartment. Someone has to make sure you're eating more than just microwave dinners. Lisa busied herself unpacking bagels and fruit. Sarah sank into a chair at the kitchen table. Tom called, she said quietly. He wants to talk about me coming back to work. Lisa paused, turning to look at her friend. Oh, how do you feel about that? Sarah shrugged her good shoulder. Honestly, I'm not sure. Part of me wants to get back to normal, you know, but another part is terrified, Lisa finished gently. Sarah nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. I don't know if I can do it, Lisa. How can I teach about nature and conservation when I can barely look at those mountains without panicking? Lisa sat down across from her, reaching out to squeeze her hand. Oh, honey, no one expects you to bounce back overnight. What happened to you was traumatic. It's okay to take your time. But what if I never get over it? Sarah whispered, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her. What if I can never go back to who I was? Then you'll find a new way forward, Lisa said firmly. You're not alone in this, Sarah. We're all here for you, me, the other teachers, your students. We'll figure it out together. Sarah nodded, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. As they ate their breakfast, the conversation drifted to lighter topics: school gossip, Lisa's latest dating disaster, plans for the upcoming fall festival. For a little while, Sarah felt almost normal. After Lisa left for work, Sarah found herself restless. The walls of her apartment seemed to close in around her, and she realized that in the week since her discharge, she hadn't once stepped outside. The thought of leaving her safe haven sent a spike of anxiety through her, but she knew she couldn't hide forever. Taking a deep breath, Sarah changed into jeans and a loose sweater that fit over her cast. She grabbed her keys and phone, then paused at the door, her hand hovering over the knob. You can do this, she murmured to herself, one step at a time. The autumn air was crisp as Sarah stepped outside, carrying with it the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. She took a moment to let her eyes adjust to the bright sunlight, then began to walk slowly down the street. At first, every sound made her flinch: a car backfiring, a dog barking, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as she continued her walk, Sarah found herself relaxing incrementally. The familiar sights of her neighborhood, Mrs. Johnson tending her roses, the Sullivan kids waiting for the school bus, old Mr. Peterson walking his ancient golden retriever, helped ground her in the present. Sarah's feet carried her to a small park a few blocks from her apartment. She found an empty bench and sat down, watching a group of squirrels chase each other around a large oak tree. The scene, so ordinary and peaceful, brought a lump to her throat. "Excuse me," a tentative voice said, startling Sarah from her thoughts. She looked up to see a young woman standing nearby, a notebook clutched in her hands. "Are you Sarah Mitchell, the teacher who was attacked by a bear in Yellowstone?" Sarah felt her heart rate increase, her palms growing sweaty. Yes, that's me," she managed to say. The woman's eyes lit up. "I'm Jenny Lawson from the Bozeman Daily Chronicle. I was wondering if you'd be willing to share your story with our readers. It's such an incredible tale of survival." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse, to run back to the safety of her apartment, but something made her pause. Maybe it was the earnest look in Jenny's eyes, or maybe it was the realization that talking about what happened might help her process it. I'm not sure," Sarah said slowly. "It's still very difficult for me to talk about." Jenny nodded, understanding. "Of course, I can't imagine what you've been through, but your story could help others, you know. It could raise awareness about bear safety, maybe even prevent something like this from happening to someone else." Sarah considered this. The thought of her experience helping others was appealing, but the idea of reliving that terrifying day in detail made her stomach churn. "Can I think about it?" she asked finally. "It's a big decision." "Of course," Jenny said, handing her a business card. "Take all the time you need, and thank you for considering it." As Jenny walked away, Sarah turned the card over in her hands, her mind racing. Could she do this? Could she face her fears head-on and turn her nightmare into something positive? She looked up at the mountains in the distance, their peaks now clear in the late morning sun. For the first time since the attack, she felt a glimmer of something other than fear when she gazed at them. It wasn't quite the old longing, but it was possibility. Sarah stood up, tucking the business card into her pocket. She had a lot to think about, decisions to make, but for now she would take Tom up on his offer to discuss returning to work. It was time to start reclaiming her life, one small step at a time. As she walked back to her apartment, Sarah felt a newfound determination growing within her. The bear had taken much from her, but it hadn't taken everything. She was still here, still fighting, and maybe, just maybe, sharing her story could be the first step on the long road to healing. Sarah stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blouse for the third time. The scar on her collarbone, a permanent reminder of the bear's claws, peeked out from beneath the fabric. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the day ahead. It had been 2 months since the attack, and today she was finally returning to work. As she gathered her things, her phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "You've got this. Remember, I'm right down the hall if you need anything." "Lunch in my room?" Sarah smiled, grateful for her friend's unwavering support. She typed back a quick "thanks, see you at lunch" before heading out the door. The drive to Bozeman High School was familiar, but Sarah found herself gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. As she pulled into the parking lot, she spotted Tom, the principal, waiting for her near the entrance. "Welcome back, Sarah," he said warmly as she approached. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," she admitted, "but ready, I think." Tom nodded understandingly. "Take it one step at a time. And remember, my door is always open if you need to talk." As they walked through the halls, Sarah was touched by the number of "Welcome back, Mrs. Mitchell" signs decorating the lockers and classroom doors. Students and fellow teachers alike greeted her with smiles and words of encouragement. Entering her classroom felt like coming home. The smell of chalk dust and old books, the colorful posters about wildlife and conservation. It was all exactly as she'd left it. Sarah ran her hand along her desk, a sense of normalcy washing over her. The first bell rang, and students began filing in. Sarah took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was prepared for this. She'd spent weeks working with her therapist on coping strategies for moments of anxiety or panic. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's good to be back." The class erupted in cheers and applause, catching Sarah off guard. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but blinked them away, smiling at her students' enthusiasm. As she began her lesson on Montana's ecosystem, Sarah found herself slipping back into the rhythm of teaching. The nervousness faded, replaced by the familiar passion for her subject. That is, until she reached the section on large predators. "Now let's talk about the role of apex predators in maintaining ecological balance," Sarah said, turning to write on the board. Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote "grizzly bears" at the top of the list. A student in the front row, Emily, raised her hand. "Mrs. Mitchell, are you okay talking about this? We heard about what happened." Sarah paused, caught off guard by the question. She looked out at the sea of concerned faces and realized that her students were just as apprehensive about this topic as she was. Taking a deep breath, she decided to address the elephant, or rather the bear, in the room. "Thank you for asking, Emily. Yes, I had a traumatic encounter with a grizzly bear this summer. It's still difficult for me to talk about, but it's important that we discuss these animals objectively." She moved to sit on the edge of her desk, facing the class. "What happened to me was rare. Grizzly bears, like all wild animals, deserve our respect and understanding. They play a crucial role in our ecosystem, and it's our responsibility to learn how to coexist safely with them." As Sarah spoke, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Talking about the attack in this context, as an educator, not a victim, was unexpectedly cathartic. The rest of the morning passed quickly. By the time the lunch bell rang, Sarah felt both exhausted and exhilarated. She made her way to Lisa's classroom, where her friend was waiting with sandwiches and a thermos of hot tea. "So, how's it going?" Lisa asked as Sarah sank into a chair. "Better than I expected," Sarah admitted. "It feels good to be back, but..." "But?" Lisa prompted gently. Sarah sighed. "I keep thinking about that reporter, Jenny, the one who wanted to interview me about the attack. I turned her down initially, but now I'm wondering if I made the right choice." Lisa considered this. "Well, what's changed? Why are you thinking about it now?" Talking to my students about bears today, it made me realize that my experience could be valuable, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a way to promote understanding and conservation. Lisa nodded encouragingly. That sounds like the Sarah I know. Always looking for the teachable moment even in something terrible. Sarah smiled ruefully. I don't know if I'm ready to relive it all in detail, though. Just the thought makes my heart race. So start small, Lisa suggested. Maybe write down your thoughts first, or do a short interview for the school paper instead of the Chronicle. Baby steps, remember? Sarah nodded, feeling a spark of determination. You're right. I think I'll talk to Tom about organizing an assembly on wilderness safety. And maybe I'll call Jenny, see if her offer still stands. The rest of the day passed in a blur of classes, conversations, and moments of quiet reflection. By the time the final bell rang, Sarah felt drained but accomplished. She had made it through her first day back, faced her fears, and even found a new sense of purpose. As she packed up her things, there was a knock at her classroom door. She looked up to see Jake, a senior known for his love of the outdoors. Mrs. Mitchell, I just wanted to say, your lesson today was really inspiring. I've always loved camping and hiking, but after hearing about your attack, I was starting to get scared of the woods. But the way you talked about respecting nature, not fearing it, it helped. So thanks. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. Thank you, Jake. That means a lot to me. After Jake left, Sarah sat at her desk for a long moment, processing the day's events. She pulled out her phone and, before she could second-guess herself, dialed the number on Jenny Lawson's business card. Hello, Jenny. This is Sarah Mitchell. I've been thinking about your interview request. I think I'm ready to tell my story. As she spoke with Jenny, arranging a time for the interview, Sarah felt a sense of purpose solidifying within her. Her experience, traumatic as it was, could be a force for good. She could use it to educate, to inspire, to promote conservation and safety. The bear had taken much from her, but it had also given her a new voice, a new mission, and Sarah was determined to make that voice heard. As she left the school, Sarah paused to look at the mountains in the distance. For the first time since the attack, she felt a flicker of the old longing. The wilderness still held danger, yes, but it also held beauty, adventure, and countless lessons. Someday, she promised herself, she would find the courage to venture back into those mountains. But for now, she had a story to tell, and a classroom full of eager minds to inspire. Sarah got into her car, feeling more like herself than she had in months. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but she was ready to face them one step at a time. Sarah sat in her living room, nervously adjusting the collar of her blouse. The coffee table in front of her was cleared, save for a glass of water and a small digital recorder. Jenny Lawson, the reporter from the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, sat across from her, notepad in hand, her expression a mixture of professional interest and gentle encouragement. Are you ready to begin, Sarah? Jenny asked, her finger hovering over the recorder's start button. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose. Jenny nodded and pressed record. This is Jenny Lawson with the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, interviewing Sarah Mitchell about her encounter with a grizzly bear in Yellowstone National Park. Sarah, why don't you start by telling us what brought you to Yellowstone that day? Closed her eyes for a moment, transporting herself back to that fateful morning. It was a beautiful autumn day, she began, her voice slightly shaky. I'd gone to Yellowstone for a solo fishing trip, something I'd done countless times before. The Lamar River was always one of my favorite spots. As Sarah recounted the events leading up to the attack, she found the words coming easier than she'd expected. She described the peacefulness of the morning, the excitement of catching trout, the sudden heart-stopping moment when she first saw the bear. It just appeared, Sarah said, her hands clenching involuntarily. One moment I was focused on the river, and the next, there it was. Massive, beautiful, in a terrifying way. Jenny leaned forward, her pen scratching across the notepad. What went through your mind in that moment? Sarah let out a humorless chuckle. Honestly? At first, nothing. It was like my brain short-circuited. Then every bear safety tip I'd ever learned started flashing through my mind all at once. Don't run, make yourself look big, speak calmly. But when it charged, Her voice trailed off, and Jenny waited patiently, allowing Sarah to collect herself. When it charged, Sarah continued after a moment, instinct took over. I ran. I know now that was the worst thing I could have done, but in that moment of pure terror, I just ran. As Sarah described the chase and the moment the bear caught, her hand unconsciously moved to her left arm, still bearing the scars beneath her sleeve. The pain was indescribable, but strangely it almost didn't register at first. All I could focus on was the bear's face, inches from mine, its breath hot on my skin. Jenny's expression was a mixture of horror and awe. How did you survive? That moment? Sarah took a sip of water, her hand trembling slightly. I played dead. Something in me just shut down. I went limp, held my breath as much as I could. I could feel the bear sniffing me, pawing at me. Every second felt like an eternity. As she recounted the long, terrifying minutes of lying motionless, hoping the bear would lose interest, Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She paused, using the breathing techniques her therapist had taught her to calm herself. "Take your time," Jenny said softly. "We can take a break if you need to." Sarah shook her head. "No, I'm okay. I want to get through this." She took another deep breath and continued, describing the moment the bear finally lumbered away, the pain and fear that crashed over her as she realized she was alone and severely injured in the wilderness. "I don't know how long I lay there," Sarah said. "I was afraid to move, afraid the bear might come back. When I finally managed to reach for my phone, I could barely dial 911 with my good hand." As she recounted the rescue, the arrival of the park rangers, the helicopter flight to the hospital, Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for the people who had saved her life that day. "The doctors later told me how lucky I was," she said. "A few inches to the left and the bear's claws would have hit my carotid artery. I could have bled out before help arrived." Jenny nodded solemnly. "You mentioned earlier that you knew running was the wrong thing to do. Looking back, is there anything you wish you had done differently?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Honestly, I've replayed that day in my mind 1,000 times, wondering if I could have prevented the attack. But the truth is, sometimes these things just happen. What I do wish is that I'd been more prepared. I had bear spray in my backpack, but it was out of reach when I needed it most. Now I make sure it's always accessible when I'm in bear country." "You still go into bear country?" Jenny asked, surprise evident in her voice. Sarah smiled wryly. "Not yet, but I'm working towards it. This experience, it changed me. For a long time I was angry. At the bear, at myself, at the wilderness I'd always loved. But I've come to realize that the bear was just being a bear. It wasn't malicious, it was just following its instincts." She leaned forward, her voice growing, passionate. "That's what I really want people to understand. We share this land with these incredible, powerful animals. It's our responsibility to learn how to coexist safely with them. That means being prepared, being aware and respecting their space." Jenny nodded, scribbling furiously. "That's a powerful message, Sarah. How has this experience changed your outlook on wildlife conservation?" Sarah's eyes lit up. "If anything, it strengthened my commitment to conservation. These animals, as dangerous as they can be, are a vital part of our ecosystem. Losing them would be a tragedy. But conservation isn't just about protecting the animals, it's about educating people too. That's why I've started giving talks at schools about wilderness safety and bear awareness." As the interview wound down, Jenny asked one final question. "Sarah, what would you say to someone who's afraid to venture into the wilderness after hearing your story?" Sarah paused, considering her words carefully. "I'd say, don't let fear keep you from experiencing the beauty of nature. Yes, there are risks, but with proper preparation and respect for the wildlife, the rewards far outweigh the dangers. The wilderness has so much to teach us if we're willing to listen." After Jenny left, Sarah sat in her living room for a long while, reflecting on the interview. Talking about the attack had been difficult, bringing back vivid memories of the terror and pain she'd experienced. But it had also been cathartic in a way she hadn't expected. She walked to the window, gazing out at the mountains in the distance. For the first time in months, she felt a stirring of the old longing to be out there, among the trees and streams. The fear was still there, a constant undercurrent, but it no longer felt paralyzing. Sarah reached for her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Lisa, it's me. Remember how you said you'd go hiking with me when I felt ready? I think I might be getting there. Maybe we could start with something small this weekend." As she made plans with her friend, Sarah felt a sense of hope blossoming within her. The bear attack had nearly broken her, but it had also revealed a strength she didn't know she possessed. She was a survivor, and now she was ready to start, truly living again. The morning sun cast long shadows across Sarah's living room as she sat at her desk, a cup of steaming coffee at her elbow and her laptop open before her. The article from the Bozeman Daily Chronicle was displayed on the screen, her own face staring back at her from the accompanying photograph. The headline read, "Local Teacher Survives Grizzly Attack, Advocates for Wildlife Education." Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself to read through the article one more time. It had been a week since its publication, and the response had been overwhelming. Her phone had been ringing off the hook with calls from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had been moved by her story. As she scrolled through the article, certain phrases jumped out at her. Harrowing encounter with a grizzly bear. In Yellowstone National Park, played dead to survive the brutal attack, now champions bear safety and conservation education. It was surreal to see her experience laid out in black and white, her private nightmare now a matter of public record. But as she reached the end of the article, with its call for increased funding for wildlife education programs, Sarah felt a sense of pride. Her story was making a difference. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Lisa standing there, a determined look on her face and 2 hiking backpacks slung over her shoulder. "Ready for our adventure?" Lisa asked, a mixture of excitement and concern in her voice. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose." Today was the day they had planned for their first hike since the attack. It was a small trail just outside of Bozeman, nothing too challenging, but it represented a massive step for Sarah. As they drove to the trailhead, Lisa kept up a steady stream of chatter, clearly trying to keep Sarah's mind off any lingering anxiety. "Did you see the response to your article? The online comments are overwhelmingly positive. People are really connecting with your story." Sarah managed a small smile. "It's been intense. I never expected it to resonate with so many people." They pulled into the small parking area at the base of the trail. As Sarah stepped out of the car, she felt her heart rate quicken. The familiar scent of pine and earth filled her nostrils, bringing with it a flood of memories, both good and terrifying. Lisa came around the car, gently placing a hand on Sarah's arm. "We don't have to do this today if you're not ready. There's no shame in taking more time." Sarah shook her head, squaring her shoulders. "No, I need to do this. I can't let fear control me forever." They began their hike, the well-maintained trail winding through a dense forest of pines and aspens. Sarah found herself constantly scanning their surroundings, her body tense and ready to flee at the slightest unexpected sound. About a mile, then they reached a small clearing. Sarah paused, her breath catching in her throat. The scene was beautiful. Wildflowers dotted the grass, and a small stream burbled nearby. But all she could see was how exposed they were, how easily a bear could emerge from the tree line. "Sarah?" Lisa's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Talk to me. What are you feeling?" Sarah took a shaky breath. I keep expecting to see a bear. Every shadow, every rustle in the bushes. It's like I'm back there in Yellowstone waiting for the attack." Lisa nodded, understanding. "That's normal after what you've been through. But look around, we're safe here. We've got our bear spray, we're making noise, we're doing everything right." As if to emphasize her point, Lisa reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bell, attaching it to her backpack. The cheerful tinkling sound filled the clearing, and Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. They continued their hike, Lisa keeping up a steady conversation and occasionally singing off-key renditions of popular songs, much to Sarah's amusement. Slowly, Sarah found herself relaxing, beginning to notice the beauty of their surroundings rather than just potential threats. As they reached the summit of the small hill, Sarah gasped. The view was spectacular, rolling hills covered in autumn colors, the distant peaks of the Rockies gleaming in the sunlight. For the first time in months, she felt a familiar stirring in her heart, the love for wild places that had always been a part of her. "Oh, Lisa," she breathed. "I'd almost forgotten how beautiful it can be out here." Lisa squeezed her friend's hand. "See, it's still here, waiting for you. The mountains, the forests, they're not your enemy." They sat for a while, sharing a packed lunch and taking in the view. As they prepared to head back down, Sarah felt a newfound sense of peace. The fear wasn't gone entirely, but it no longer consumed her. On the drive back to Bozeman, Sarah's phone buzzed with a new email. It was from the Montana Wildlife Federation, inviting her to speak at their annual conference about her experience and the importance of wildlife education. "Lisa," Sarah said, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and nervousness, "I think I just got my first speaking invitation." Lisa grinned. "That's fantastic. Are you going to do it?" Sarah considered. For a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I think I am. If my story can help even one person be safer in bear country or gain a better understanding of these animals, then it's worth sharing." As they pulled up to Sarah's apartment, Lisa turned to her friend. "I'm proud of you, you know. What you did today getting back out there, that took real courage." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." That evening, as Sarah sat down to respond to the Wildlife Federation's invitation, she felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since the attack. Her experience, traumatic as it was, had given her a unique perspective and a powerful voice. She was determined to use that voice to promote understanding, safety, and conservation. She glanced at the framed copy of the Chronicle article on her wall, then at the hiking boots by her door, still dusty from the day's adventure. The bear attack had nearly broken her, but it had also revealed a strength she didn't know she possessed. She was more than just a survivor now. She was an advocate, an educator, and a bridge between the world of humans and the wilderness she still loved. As she began to type her acceptance of the speaking invitation, Sarah felt a sense of excitement building within her. This was just the beginning. She had a story to tell, a message to share, and a newfound mission to fulfill. The journey ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in months, Sarah Mitchell felt truly alive and ready to face whatever came next. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the Lamar River, her fishing rod held loosely in her hands. The early morning mist was just beginning to lift, revealing the stunning landscape of Yellowstone National Park. It had been exactly 1 year since the bear attack that had nearly claimed her life on this very spot. She took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp mountain air. The familiar scents of pine and wild sage filled her nostrils, bringing with them a flood of memories, both terrifying and beautiful. Her heart rate quickened, but not with the paralyzing fear that had gripped her for so long. This time, it was a mixture of anticipation and respect for the wild place she had once again chosen to enter. "You okay there, Sarah?" Lisa called from a few yards downstream, her voice laced with concern. Sarah turned to her friend and nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Yeah, I'm good. Just taking it all in." The past year had been a journey of recovery, both physical and emotional. The scars on her body had faded to silvery lines, reminders of her brush with death. The psychological scars had taken longer to heal, but with time, therapy, and the unwavering support of her friends and family, Sarah had slowly reclaimed her life and her passion for the outdoors. She cast her line into the rushing water, the familiar motion bringing a sense of peace. As she watched the fly dance across the surface of the river, Sarah reflected on the changes the past year had brought. Her story in the Bozeman Daily Chronicle had sparked a wave of interest in bear safety and conservation. What had started as a single speaking engagement at the Montana Wildlife Federation conference had turned into a series of talks at schools, community centers, and even a TEDx event. Sarah had found her voice as an advocate for responsible wildlife. Interaction and education. "Got one!" Lisa's excited shout broke through Sarah's reverie. She looked over to see her friend skillfully reeling in a good-sized trout. Sarah grinned, feeling a surge of competitive spirit. "Nice catch. But I bet I can land a bigger one." As they fished, the two friends fell into easy conversation, punctuated by comfortable silences. It was during one of these quiet moments that Sarah spotted movement on the far bank of the river. Her breath caught in her throat as a large grizzly bear emerged from the tree line. For a moment, she was transported back to that terrifying day, a year ago. Her heart raced and she felt the old fear threatening to overwhelm her. But then something remarkable happened. As she watched the bear amble along the riverbank, pausing to sniff at the water's edge, Sarah felt her fear transform into something else, a profound sense of awe and respect. "Sarah?" Lisa's voice was tense. "Should we leave?" Sarah shook her head slowly, keeping her eyes on the bear. "No, we're okay. We're at a safe distance and it doesn't seem interested in us. Let's just stay alert and enjoy the moment." They watched in silence as the bear fished in the shallows, its powerful paws swiping at the water with surprising grace. After a few minutes, it lumbered back into the forest, disappearing as quietly as it had arrived. "Wow," Lisa breathed. "That was intense. How are you feeling?" Sarah took a moment to assess her emotions. "Honestly, I feel okay. Better than okay, actually." "It was beautiful, wasn't it?" Lisa nodded, a look of admiration on her face. "You've come a long way, Sarah. A year ago, that sight would have sent you into a panic attack." "A year ago, I never thought I'd set foot in these woods again," Sarah admitted. "But here I am. I guess that's what they call progress, huh?" As they packed up their gear and began the hike back to their campsite, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her back to this place. The countless therapy sessions, the nightmares that had slowly faded, the small steps that had led to bigger ones, like her first hike with Lisa, her first public speaking engagement, and now her return to Yellowstone. Back at the campsite, as they sat around the fire roasting marshmallows, Lisa raised her mug of cocoa in a toast. "To Sarah Mitchell, bear attack survivor, wildlife educator, and the bravest person I know." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. "I couldn't have done it without you, you know. Without all of you." She thought of her parents, her students, the doctors and therapists who had helped her heal, and the countless strangers who had reached out after reading her story. As the fire crackled and the stars came out overhead, Sarah pulled out her journal. She had started writing shortly after the attack, finding it therapeutic to put her thoughts and feelings on paper. Now it had become a habit, a way to process her experiences and track her progress. She opened to a fresh page and began to write. "1 year ago, I thought my life was over. The bear that attacked me took more than just flesh and bone. It took my sense of safety, my love for the wild, my belief in myself. But sitting here now, back in the place where it all happened, I realize that I've gained so much more than I lost. I've gained a deeper understanding of the delicate balance between humans and wildlife. I've found a voice I never knew I had, a platform to educate and inspire others. I've discovered a strength within myself that I never knew existed. The scars on my body tell a story of survival, but they also remind me of the beauty and power of the natural world. I respect it now more than ever, not with fear, but with awe and humility. I am not the same person I was before the attack. I am stronger, wiser, more compassionate. I am a survivor, an educator, an advocate, and I am grateful for this second chance at life, for the opportunity to make a difference, and for the wild places that continue to call to my soul." Sarah closed her journal, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She looked up at the star-filled sky, then out at the dark silhouettes of the surrounding forest. The wilderness that had once been a source of terror now felt like home again. As she crawled into her tent that night, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had faced her fears, reclaimed her passion, and found a new purpose in life. Tomorrow she would wake up and fish again, hike again, live again, fully and without reservation. The bear had changed her life irrevocably, but it hadn't defeated her. Instead, it had set her on a new path, one that allowed her to appreciate the beauty of the wild while respecting its dangers. As she drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle sounds of the forest, Sarah Mitchell knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be.